This dam poses an existential threat to India. July 19, 2025. A groundbreaking ceremony was held for the downstream hydropower project on the Yarlung-Zangbo River. The Premier of China's State Council attended in person, signifying the nation's commitment to the project. With a total investment exceeding 1.2 trillion yuan, this mega-project is slated for full completion by 2045. Once operational, its annual power generation will reach 300 billion kilowatt-hours, roughly 3 times that of the Three Gorges Dam. This will massively increase China's total power output and improve the country's energy mix. The construction and operation of the project will also be a major catalyst for economic development in the surrounding regions, and neighboring countries stand to benefit as well. However, India has reacted to the implementation of this hydropower project with outrage. From high-ranking government officials down to uninformed netizens, many are clamoring that China is threatening India's national security. Why is India reacting this way? And what impact will the completion of the Medak hydropower station really have on the country? The truth is, India's anxiety over this upstream dam is, at its core, a case of projection. They don't know what impact China building a hydropower station will have on them, but they know exactly how they would leverage such a position to control a downstream country. In fact, despite its woefully inadequate engineering capabilities and its inability to truly regulate a river's flow at will, India already uses its upstream position to try and control its own downstream neighbors. Over the past decade, even with the internationally mediated Indus Waters Treaty in place, India has repeatedly threatened to cut off water supplies to Pakistan. This behavior has only intensified as the global situation has grown more chaotic. With the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East capturing the world's attention, and a potential second Trump presidency threatening a global tariff war that would leave nations reeling, India believes no country has the bandwidth to intervene in South Asian affairs. Seizing the opportunity, India put its threats into practice. Using the flimsy pretext that Pakistan was supporting terrorist organizations to carry out attacks in India, it announced the suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty. Although India had long intended to use water to control Pakistan and had made many preparations, it was ultimately hamstrung by its abysmal engineering capabilities. India built a series of reservoirs upstream, but their capacity is so limited that they would overflow in days if mismanaged when water levels are high.
They tried to hold back the river. This is without even considering whether India's poorly constructed dams could withstand the pressure of water levels exceeding their design limits without collapsing. Yet even with these subpar water projects, India still manages to wreak havoc on downstream Pakistan by arbitrarily cutting off water one moment and releasing floodwaters the next, all without warning. While this weaponization of water resources has drawn widespread condemnation from the international community, India continues to act unilaterally. Even after suffering a major setback in an air skirmish with Pakistan and being forced to accept a ceasefire, it has refused to relinquish control over water as a weapon and has not resumed its obligations under the Indus Waters Treaty. It is only because Pakistan's national power is weaker than India's, and because it understands that India's reservoirs have limited regulatory capacity and cannot cause an unmanageable disaster, even when operated with maximum malice, that Pakistan has not pressed the issue further. Since India itself is determined to use water as a weapon against downstream nations, it naturally assumes that all other countries think the same way. The Yarlung-Zangbo River flows out of the Tibetan Plateau and turns south into India, where it becomes a major tributary of the Brahmaputra and eventually the Ganges. It is therefore no surprise that China's plan to build a new hydropower facility on the river has caused extreme anxiety in India. After all, the Three Gorges project proved China's world-class dam-building capabilities. If China truly wanted to, it could easily accomplish the malicious acts India dreams of but cannot execute, cutting off water during the dry season and unleashing floods during the rainy season. As a former British colony, India may be independent, but its thinking and methods still reflect a Western hegemonic mindset. It only understands zero-sum games, not win-win cooperation. It fails to see that in China's view, there is a far better path. Instead of weaponizing water resources and creating tensions with neighbors, China believes the better choice is to use reservoirs for disaster prevention and relief while developing hydropower, thereby strengthening strategic trust and promoting international cooperation in the region. Furthermore, China's position isn't just talk, it is consistently put into practice. Home to the Tibetan Plateau, known as Asia's water tower, China is the source of more than just the Yarlung-Zangbo. The Langkang-Mekong River, a vital water source for several Southeast Asian nations, also originates in China. Compared to the Medog project, which must overcome significant challenges like high-altitude construction and complex geology, developing the Langkang's hydropower resources was far easier. China built a series of dams there over a decade ago.
Initially, to smear China, Western media hyped up the narrative that China's upstream dams would disrupt the downstream ecosystem, causing great alarm among Southeast Asian countries, which voiced considerable opposition. But as these hydropower projects became operational, these nations gradually realized that necessary water infrastructure is actually beneficial for mitigating the impacts of floods and droughts. This is especially true when the facilities are controlled by a responsible major power. Contrary to Western claims that China would hoard water in the dry season and release it during the wet season, China has consistently taken the needs of downstream countries into full account, maximizing the reservoir's role in disaster prevention for the entire river basin. China has even been willing to release water during dry spells and absorb floodwaters during rainy seasons to aid its neighbors, even when facing its own disaster pressures. As a result, in 2017, when the lower Mekong once again faced a drought and the West predictably blamed Chinese dams, the Mekong River Commission, an intergovernmental organization founded by 4 downstream nations, publicly refuted these claims on its official website. Not only that, but the electricity generated from the Langkang River now supplies China's own needs while also being exported to neighboring Southeast Asian countries, most of whom have benefited. Even setting aside the successful example of the Langkang-Mekong cooperation, a look at the Medog Dam's design plans reveals that China has no intention of weaponizing water. The Medog station uses a run-of-the-river design that diverts water through tunnels cutting straight through mountain bends. It relies on a small upstream reservoir, generating power primarily from the massive drop in elevation, head, not from the volume of water flow. If China were thinking like India and wanted to create a water weapon, it would never choose this design. It would have built a massive dam directly along the river channel to maximize reservoir capacity and its ability to regulate water flow. In fact, that design would have been far less difficult to construct than drilling tunnels through mountains. Yet China chose the more challenging engineering solution because its goal is to harness the immense hydropower potential created by the massive elevation drop in the Medog section of the Yarlung-Zangbo. Considering the difficulty and cost of storing electricity, and the reality that the Tibetan region is sparsely populated with limited industry, it is highly likely that the power generated by the Medog station will be sold to neighboring countries. As the country closest to Medog, and one that suffers from chronic power shortages, India would be the most logical and primary beneficiary. However, all of this hinges on India abandoning its unrealistic ambitions of being a little hegemon in South Asia. In particular, it must give up its claims on Chinese territory. India has long seen itself as the successor to the British Empire's influence in Asia, even fantasizing about achieving what Britain never could, the annexation of Tibet. Even after being taught a harsh lesson by the People's Liberation Army in 1962, India didn't stay quiet for long. As soon as the war ended, it began rewriting the narrative of the war for its domestic audience and resumed its aggressive posture toward China. While the general populace may be brainwashed by government propaganda due to their limited access to information, those in the highest levels of government have seen the real battle reports and understand the true gap in military strength between China and India. The Indian government dares to provoke China despite being the weaker power for two reasons. First, it banks on China's commitment to a higher moral standard, believing Beijing won't retaliate over minor, unsuccessful provocations. Second, it has historically relied on its geographical advantages. While China's Tibetan Plateau holds the high ground over India, the plateau's extreme cold, lack of oxygen, and complex terrain make it inhospitable for large populations and industry. This has always made logistics and supply lines for China on the border extremely difficult. For a long time, Maydog County, on the front line of the China-India confrontation, didn't even have a single highway. China's attempts to build a road to Maydog starting in 1965 were repeatedly halted by practical difficulties. It wasn't until 2010 when China completed the Gelongla Tunnel and bypassed a treacherous snow-covered mountain pass that the new Maydog Highway finally opened in 2013, ending the county's roadless history. Even so, this highway remains a Class 4 highway, the lowest grade in China's system, with its narrowest point at just 4.5 meters wide, and it is frequently threatened by landslides and mudflows. Such poor transportation conditions can hardly support large-scale military deployments. In contrast, India's task of transporting troops and supplies to the border is much easier, with only the final stretch near the front lines being difficult, a problem that can be solved by simply making its low-caste soldiers bear the brunt of the hardship. But the construction of the Maydog hydropower station changes everything. To get heavy construction equipment to the site, the transportation lines into Maydog must be drastically upgraded. Furthermore, once the station is complete, the abundance of electricity will spur an industrial boom. Just as oil transformed Daqing and the Three Gorges project transformed Yichang, a thriving industrial city will emerge in Maydog, and a prosperous city is a perfect logistics hub for the military. With that, not only would India be unable to advance further, but it would likely struggle to maintain its current illegal occupation of the area it calls Arunachal Pradesh, South Tibet. From this perspective, India's panic isn't entirely baseless. For India, returning South Tibet to China and losing the advantage of occupying Chinese territory is a small matter. Even being completely overlooked from China's strategic high ground isn't the biggest problem. The critical issue is that the national unity India has painstakingly built on a foundation of historical revisionism could completely collapse. Just as in the 1962 border war, when China never crossed the traditional boundary line, yet India's national morale crumbled, sending officials and civilians in the capital fleeing in panic, no one knows what would happen if there were a repeat. And this time, if China didn't voluntarily withdraw to its original line of control, would India itself fragment and collapse?